this video that if you are sensitive to infant death, SIDS, crib death, postpartum depression, please consider this an additional trigger warning. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. This video is going to be about the Kathleen Folbig story, which takes place in Australia. This one is interesting because she would go to prison for 20 years for potential crimes to then be pardoned and released. Now the question is, was she innocent? Was her conviction based on misogyny? Was an error made? So we're going to talk about that today. Let's quickly get our housekeeping out of the way first. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, I would greatly appreciate if you considered doing so. Second, please check out the pinned comment down below where I will list 3 cases that I am interested in covering and would love for you to vote on the one that sounds the most interesting. Next are our hidden gems. When you hear me give out the hidden gem, please make sure to comment it down below. And then finally, if you are interested in non-true crime related content like story times and whisper rambles, please check out my non-true crime channel called Opal. So let's dive into this case together. When Kathleen Megan Marlborough left school in 1982, she was 15 years old. Like many kids her age with limited education, she would work several low-paying jobs to try to make ends meet and would get married around the age of 20 years old. She would marry a man by the name of Craig Folbig, who was a steel worker and was 25 years old. They would settle in Mayfield, which was a suburb of Newcastle, Australia's 6th largest city, which was about an hour's drive north of Sydney. Within a year of getting married, Kathleen would find herself pregnant, and she would give birth to their first child, a son, by the name of Caleb, in February of 1989. And at the time of his birth, Caleb was described as full term and healthy. 5 days later, Kathleen would take him home from the hospital. And one morning, while feeding him, Kathleen noticed that Caleb was having difficulty breathing. And so she would take him back to the hospital where doctors would diagnose him as having a lazy larynx. At 8 p.m. on February 19th of 1989, Kathleen would put Caleb in his crib to go to sleep for the night. At 2:50 a.m. the following morning, Craig Folbig was awoken by his wife's screams. Running to the sunroom, which was essentially like their nursery where Caleb would sleep, Craig would find his wife, Kathleen, standing over the crib screaming. She was screaming, saying, "My baby, something is wrong with my baby." And tragically, Caleb Folbig was dead at just 20 days old. The official cause of death was listed as sudden infant death syndrome, which is SIDS, or known as cot or crib death. And this time she would give birth to another son by the name of Patrick in June of 1990. On October 18th of 1990, Kathleen would put Patrick to bed. Craig would look in on him at 10 p.m. and he recalls that he appeared to be sleeping peacefully. But again, the next morning, this time at around 3:30 a.m., Craig would be awoken by Kathleen's screams. According to a police statement, he would rush into Patrick's room and saw his wife standing over Patrick, who was lying in his crib. Craig would pick up the baby and noted faint, labored breathing. He would attempt to do a CPR to resuscitate Patrick until the ambulance arrived. Patrick would regain consciousness, but would later be found to now suffer from epilepsy and be blind, which my guess is probably from the lack of oxygen during the time that he had to be resuscitated. Now, at this moment, Patrick survives, but unfortunately it would not be for long. On the morning of February 13th of 1991, which was just about 3 years after Caleb dies, Kathleen would call Craig at work and said that it happened again. Craig would leave work and arrived at the house just as the ambulance had come. Patrick would be taken to the hospital, but unfortunately was pronounced dead on arrival. So an autopsy would be conducted, and the cause of death was an acute asphyxiating event resulting from an epileptic fit or a seizure. Now, I can't even imagine what this family must be feeling at this time, that their two only sons have now passed from perhaps something SIDS related. So, following Patrick's death, Kathleen and Craig would relocate and moved to Thornton, which was a town northwest of Newcastle. A year later, Kathleen would be pregnant again, and this was this time a girl, and their daughter Sarah was born in October of 1992. All would seem well until 11 months later when Sarah caught a cold and was having trouble sleeping. By 1:30 a.m. the next morning, Sarah was no longer alive. So now this is their third child to have passed. According to police reports, this time Craig was awoken by Kathleen's screams and saw her standing in the doorway of their bedroom. Sarah was lying in bed, motionless, and her death would officially be attributed to SIDS. The couple would spend 2 years in the Thornton area after Sarah's death, and they would then become pregnant for a 4th time. Their second daughter, Laura, would be born in August of 1997. Laura was apparently healthy when Kathleen brought her home 3 days later from the hospital. Unlike her siblings, Laura's breathing and sleep patterns were monitored closely for several weeks after her birth, just to be sure that she would not also end up passing like her siblings, which was fine. She made it to 19 months old until she caught a cold. Kathleen would give Laura some medication, to help with these cold symptoms. But at 12:05 p.m. on March 1st of 1999, she would call an ambulance after Laura allegedly stopped breathing. According to the official report, 2 ambulance officers arrived to find Kathleen performing CPR on her daughter. They would examine Laura and find that she was no longer breathing and did not have a pulse. So, just like before with the other siblings that passed away, an autopsy was conducted, but unlike the others, the coroner considered Laura to be too old to have succumbed to SIDS, and he would record her cause of death as undetermined and ordered a police investigation. When Detective Sergeant Bernard Ryan was assigned to investigate Laura's death, he could have looked at the case as just one more tragic crib death. But following the coroner's finding, he decided to consider all of the possibilities. Detective Ryan began his investigation routinely by interviewing Kathleen and Craig. Now, when he started this investigation, he thought that Laura was the only child of theirs that passed. But when he learned that Laura was their 4th child to have died in a similar fashion, his suspicions grew. The case would then take an unexpected turn. After Laura's death, Kathleen and Craig would split up, which is not at all uncommon in cases like this. When Kathleen left, apparently she didn't take much in the way of her possessions from their home. And while Craig was cleaning up, he would make an unpleasant discovery. In a bedside drawer, he would find her diaries, whose contents, he would eventually tell in court, made him want to vomit, and he would take them to the police. He told police that he had had the odd suspicion, but after finding Kathleen's diaries, his suspicions became horribly real. Detective Ryan would learn that Kathleen had been keeping diaries for most of her life, but had thrown most of them away. But apparently the ones that Craig had found had obviously been overlooked. Her diary entries indicated a woman torn by mixed emotion. On one hand, she wanted children to prove she could do it, just like other women could, and described the feeling of having a child growing inside her and being impatient for the birth. She would write things like, "We're all waiting, little one. When will you come?" On the other hand, she would write about frustrations of being a mother, including her inability to breastfeed despite numerous fruitless attempts with each child. She also wrote about the resentment she felt after each birth when the attention shifted away from her to the new baby, describing it as a feeling of abandonment just like she had experienced as a child, where she was in a family but never felt like part of it. She would write about her wild mood swings and how she watched fish swim in a tank to try and calm herself. She would write, "I don't know. How do I conquer this? Help is what I want." Her diary entries would disclose her innermost fears. She worried that Craig would leave her. She felt threatened when he teased her about her weight and wrote about how she couldn't deal with his perpetual flirtations. At one point, when he rejected her advances because of her pregnancy, she wrote that Craig's roving eye will always be of concern to me. An entry would also say, must lose extra weight or he will be even less in love with me than he is now. I know that physical appearance means everything to him. When she was pregnant with Laura, she wrote, on a good note, Craig said last night he accepts that I'm not going to be skinny again. That's wonderful, but I know deep in my heart he wants his skinny wife back. Time after time, she would write about her weight and Craig's preoccupation with it. She would say, I've got to start changing my life and becoming a hot-looking, energetic mother for my daughter and a sexy wife for my husband. An entry on November 13th of 1996 indicated the isolation that she felt even from her own family. Why is family so important to me, she wrote. I now have the start of my very own, but it doesn't seem good enough. I know Craig doesn't understand. He has the knowledge and stability and love from siblings and parents, even if he chooses to ignore them. Me, I have no one but him. It seems to affect me so. Why should it matter? It shouldn't. Now, there were other entries that seemed more sinister. She would write how stress made her do terrible things and spoke of flashes of rage, resentment, and hatred toward her children. The diaries also indicate that she had no control over her depression and feelings of resentment. She would write about wanting to wake her husband up and ask for help. One entry marked 9:45 on June 11th, which was a Wednesday in 1997, read, my brain has too much happening, unstored and unrecalled memories just waiting. Heaven help the day they surface and I recall. That will be the day to lock me up and throw away the key. Something I am sure will happen one day. There were some entries that spoke specifically about her treatment of her children. Like, I feel like the worst mother on this earth, scared that she, as in Laura, will leave me now like Sarah did. I knew I was short-tempered and cruel sometimes to her, and she left with a bit of help. Now, those were just some examples of what was found in her diary. There was a lot more, but those were some of the main ones, and this is what Sergeant Ryan would be faced with. And so he would begin to build a case against Kathleen. From the time that he started the long process of interviews and depositions to compile a chain of evidence, Ryan was often warned by doctors that he faced an uphill battle proving his case in court. But as he dug into Kathleen's past, Ryan would uncover a terrible secret. Something that I found incredibly interesting about Kathleen's history of her life was that her father, Thomas John Britton, had killed her mother, whose name was Kathleen Mary Donovan, outside their home in the Sydney suburb of Annandale, and he had stabbed her 24 times. When this happened, Kathleen was only 18 months old, and at the trial of her mother's murder, 6 months after her death, a woman who had witnessed the murder would give evidence against Thomas. She would testify that after brutally murdering Kathleen, that Thomas had knelt down and kissed her, saying, quote, "I'm sorry, darling, I had to do it." Thomas was convicted of murder and sent to prison, and little 18-month-old Kathleen was then sent to a church orphanage. 12 years after this, Thomas would be released from prison and deported to the United Kingdom. Kathleen would stay at this orphanage until she was 3 years old, at which time she was adopted by a foster family who lived in a Newcastle suburb. Kathleen wouldn't actually end up learning the truth about her parents until she was in her adulthood. So, on October 14th of 1996, with 3 of her children already deceased, Kathleen would make a diary entry that indicated how the tumultuous events of her childhood had really impacted her. She would write, quote, "Obviously, I am my father's daughter. It was to be her undoing," end quote. So Detective Ryan would take 2 years to assemble a case that prosecutors could try with a good chance of a conviction. On April 19th of 2001, Kathleen was arrested at her home, taken into custody, and charged with murdering all 4 of her children. During her bail hearing at Maitland Local Court, police prosecutor Daniel Mayer told the court that the prosecution would show evidence from Kathleen's own diaries, technical evidence from pathology experts, and testimony from her estranged husband to prove that she had killed her children, rather than them succumbing to SIDS, at least 3 of them. While each individual child's death had not raised much concern at the time of their deaths, this prosecutor would tell the court that it was their collective deaths that could only be attributed to suffocation. He would say that the circumstances surrounding their deaths were not consistent with sudden infant death syndrome. This included the fact that each child was found face up. They were still warm when found, and in 2 cases there were signs of life. He also cited medical evidence from the United States given by forensic pathologist Dr. Janice Opoven that showed the chances of Sid's death being responsible in this kind of a scenario were 1 trillion to 1. So what that means is basically this is the only case that has occurred in the world like this, and according to these pathologists, it just was not likely. He would also tell the court that Kathleen did not appear to grieve after each child's death. Extensive tests had ruled out the possibility that the children suffered fatal genetic or viral disorders, according to something he said to the court. Now, while admitting that the diary entries were circumstantial, the prosecutor would argue that they contributed to her partial admission of guilt. A man by the name of Brian Doyle, who was Kathleen's defense counsel, would tell the court that the deaths were a coincidence, adding, "Every one of the children was in fact ill in their lifetime before their death." Doyle would tell the court that the medical experts the prosecution would call as expert witnesses had come to their conclusions after being supplied with Kathleen's diaries and other statements. So what we have at the end of this entirely is based on coincidence, according to Brian Doyle. After hearing his submissions, Magistrate Richard Wakely refused bail and ordered Kathleen be held in custody to await her trial. So during the 2-month trial at Darlinghurst Supreme Court in Sydney, Australia, the prosecution was led by Crown Prosecutor Mark Tedeschi, and he presented strong evidence that portrayed Kathleen as a woman preoccupied with her own life and looks, more interested in going to the gym and nightclubs than looking after her own children. Focusing on the same evidence presented at the bail hearing, the Crown Prosecutor made the assertion that Kathleen had a low stress threshold and would have murdered her 4 children by smothering each of them over a 10-year period because she could no longer deal with the day-to-day responsibility of being a mother. He would also criticize Professor Hilton, the pathologist who had conducted Sarah's post-mortem examination. He would claim that he had been wrong to attribute Sarah's death to SIDS when he was aware of the family history. The prosecutor would also tell the court that because of Professor Hilton's finding, a full police investigation or coronial inquiry was never called. So basically he's telling him that he did not do his job properly and that this was a miscarriage of justice at the time of this little girl's death. The court would also hear that the chances of Laura dying of SIDS were extremely low because during her life she was exhaustively investigated, monitored, and had lived beyond the SIDS danger period. And in order to support this theory, the prosecution would call on Dr. Christopher Seaton, the doctor in charge of the Sleep Investigation Unit at Sydney's Westmead Children's Hospital. Dr. Seaton would tell the court that Laura's risk of dying from SIDS compared with other children was infinitely perhaps less than average, which is 1 in 1,000. The Crown also asserted that Kathleen avoided investigation because none of the children had showed signs of abuse, so the matter was never reported to the Department of Child Services. The defense at the trial, led by lawyer Peter Zara, refuted the claim and based their argument on the fact that the children had all been sick prior to their deaths. And to strengthen this argument, Peter Zara would call on Professor Roger Byard, a forensic pathologist who told the court that it was possible the children died from suffocation and medical problems relating to each of the 4 children, which could explain their deaths in isolation. Professor Roger Byard was considered an expert on SIDS or crib deaths, and so he would say, quote, "But the fact that there are all the other deaths in the family makes me less certain. I say undetermined because of the circumstances," end quote. Asked in cross-examination whether it was possible the children had died from deliberate suffocation, Professor Byard would essentially respond saying that this was a possibility, but he declined to draw a stronger conclusion as he had not examined the death sites and the deceased children himself. When questioned regarding the deaths of Patrick from epilepsy and Sarah from myocarditis, which is a heart disease, Professor Byard said there was nothing in the pathology to show that Patrick died of epilepsy, and added that only 1 child per year in Australia died of myocarditis. Crown prosecutor Tedeschi shifted his attention to the incriminating diary entries, claiming that they showed Kathleen as deeply resentful of the intrusion her children had on her own life, in particular on her sleep, her ability to go to the gym, and her ability to socialize. He drew attention to the fact that Kathleen was worried about her weight, telling the court, quote, "She was constantly preoccupied to an exaggerated degree on her weight gain, due in part to the fact that she could not get to the gym because of her children," end quote. He would call on witnesses to attest to the fact that Kathleen showed no obvious reaction to the deaths of her 4 children. A hospital nurse described her as detached, and Deborah Grace, who was Kathleen's neighbor, gave evidence that she was straight-faced after Laura's death. She would say that there were no tears in her eyes. There was nothing at all. Kathleen's foster sister would also be called upon as a witness and would tell the court that Kathleen's demeanor changed suddenly at Laura's funeral, from crying to being a totally different person, saying that all of a sudden she was happy, laughing, and enjoying it as if it were a party. Now, during this presentation of evidence, Kathleen would remain calm, almost cool, but during the 4th week of the trial, she broke down as a video recording of her 1999 interview with police was played for the court. Crying uncontrollably, Kathleen attempted to leave the nearby hospital where she was sedated. Crying uncontrollably, Kathleen attempted to leave the courtroom but was restrained by court staff and conveyed to a nearby hospital where she was sedated. The trial was delayed for several days while Kathleen recovered from this, and then when it resumed, Greg was called to give evidence against his former wife. In his testimony, he related the details of each baby's death and described the terrifying growl that Kathleen would produce when she got frustrated with her children. He also would tell the court how Kathleen had pinned Laura to her high chair and attempted to force feed her before dumping her on the floor with the words, quote, "Go to your effing father," end quote. And this apparently was just several hours before Laura died. Now, 2 months after the trial began and the evidence was presented, the lawyers for both sides completed their closing statements, and the judge directed the jury to retire to consider their verdict. They would return in less than 8 hours and told the courtroom that they had reached a verdict. They would find Kathleen Megan Folbig guilty of murdering her 4 children. And as the verdicts were read, Kathleen broke down and cried, and at one point turned toward her sister in the public gallery before slumping forward with her head in her hands. She was taken to Malawa Women's Detention Center, where she was placed in protective isolation, as women in prison apparently take a very dim view of women who kill children, especially their own. The following August, she would return to court to hear Justice Graham Barr officially sentence her to 40 years in prison with a non-parole period of 30 years. Outside of the court, Greg would be interviewed, and he would break into tears, telling these reporters that his humble thanks goes to the 12 people whom he had never formally met, who today shares the honor of having helped set 4 beautiful souls free to rest in peace finally. And then following this sentencing, Kathleen's lawyers would also make a brief statement indicating that they would begin working on an appeal at their first opportunity. Several weeks after the trial concluded, Kathleen would write a scathing letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, expressing her anger at this decision. It took 4 years to come up with a totally circumstantial, non-factual hearsay case, according to Kathleen. She would say, quote, "I now face being the most hated woman around at the moment, and death threats are a real consideration." End quote. On the subject of her diaries, she would write, quote, "It's a sad day when a mother can be put away for merely being a normal mother who wrote down her emotions, anxieties, and frustrations in bloody books." End quote. She would also defend herself against claims her demeanor was aloof and unemotional. She would write, quote, "I did not have the choice to be any other way. I would not have been useful in my own defense. The day may come where it is time to release it all, but till my battle is done in clearing my name and reputation, that day is not yet." End quote. She would also include claims that her husband had betrayed her in this entire process, and said that she had suffered greatly at the hands of Greg and his capability to deliver with his tongue and his quite amazing ability to turn simple into exaggerated and extravagant tales. Now, after the trial, Melbourne University associate professor by the name of Anne Buist, an expert in post-birth psychiatric disorders, would tell reporters that genetic predisposition, along with the loss of her mother at a young age, could have led Kathleen to murder her children. As we know, her father had killed her mother, and so that's where this potentially genetic tie comes into play. This professor would also discuss the idea of neglect or emotional abuse of young children. A lot of studies have shown that this can affect your development very significantly. Both your brain development, your actual structural biological development, if it starts early enough, as well as development at the level of not having a good parenting model, can really affect your self-esteem. A leading Sydney forensic psychiatrist by the name of Rod Milton would also agree that the genetic implications of this case could not be rejected. Let's go ahead and fast forward to 20 years later after this happens. So this transpires this year of 2023, like the very beginning in January. Kathleen was pardoned and released after 2 decades in prison over the deaths of her 4 children, following a decision of the New South Wales Attorney General, Michael Daly. Throughout this time, from the time that she was arrested until the time of her pardoning, Kathleen would consistently maintain her innocence and served 20 years of a 25-year sentence, because we know that it was at like 40 years, and then they said that it was at least 30 years, no parole, but at some point they get it down to 25. 25, so she had served 20 of those 25 years, starting in 2003 when she was convicted of the murders of her kids. Michael Daly would release summary findings prepared by an inquiry into Kathleen's convictions that had been led by the former state Chief Justice Thomas Bathurst. Bathurst would tell the Attorney General that he had reached a firm view that there was reasonable doubt as to the guilt of Kathleen for each of the offenses for which she was originally tried. So, a recent inquiry, within the last couple of years, was done by scientists looking into this case, and they come to the conclusion that they believe that Caleb, Patrick, Sarah, and Laura may have actually died naturally. Now at this time, Kathleen is 55 years old, and this is described as one of Australia's greatest miscarriages of justice. There were previous appeals that take place, and a separate 2019 inquiry into the case found no grounds for reasonable doubt and gave greater weight to circumstantial evidence in Kathleen's original trial. But at the fresh inquiry that was headed by retired Judge Tom Bathurst, prosecutors would accept that research on gene mutations had changed their understanding of these 4 children's deaths. So, as a result of advanced technology, advanced understanding of genetics and mutations, they would then proceed in assigning of a full pardon and ordered Kathleen's immediate release from prison. Even with this information coming to light, her ex-husband Craig still would essentially stick by the fact that he believed her to be a murderer, and his lawyers would point to the quote fundamental implausibility of 4 children from one family dying of natural causes under the age of 2. Now, the unconditional pardon does not squash Kathleen's convictions, according to Mr. Daly, and he said that that would be a decision for the Court of Criminal Appeal. If Mr. Bathurst chooses to refer the case to it, which is a process which can take up to a year. If Kathleen's convictions are overturned, she could then potentially sue the government for millions of dollars in compensation. Kathleen's case has been compared to that of Lindy Chamberlain, who in 1982 was found guilty of the murder of her 9-week-old daughter, despite her claim that an animal had taken the baby. She would be awarded around $1.3 million in 1992, 10 years after her wrongful conviction. But there are some advocates that say the case of Miss Chamberlain, imprisoned for 3 years, pales in comparison with Kathleen's. Kathleen's lawyer would say, quote, "It is impossible to comprehend the injury that has been inflicted upon Kathleen, the pain of losing her children, and close to 2 decades locked away in maximum security prisons." End quote. So as we know, Kathleen's 2003 trial really centered on circumstantial evidence, which most notably were the diaries which expressed her struggles with motherhood. Those diaries were given to the police in 1999 by her husband Craig, who in time became convinced that his wife was guilty. Now, Again, there was no physical evidence of smothering or injuries to these children, so really everything was based on their unexpected deaths as well as these diary entries. A campaign was led by some of Kathleen's friends that prompted a petition to review her convictions based on forensic pathology findings. And at the recent inquiry, a team of immunologists found that Kathleen's daughters shared a genetic mutation called CalM2G11.4R that can cause sudden cardiac death. Evidence was also uncovered that her sons possessed a different genetic mutation linked to sudden onset epilepsy in mice. The inquiry heard Patrick had epileptic seizures in months before his death. They would also take a look at Kathleen's DNA to look for any genetic abnormalities. And a professor that led the research team from the Australian National University said that an unusual genetic sequence was immediately obvious in Kathleen's DNA. This professor would say that there were only 134 known cases worldwide of the potentially deadly heart condition known as calmodulopathy linked to this genetic mutation. This professor described this revelation and finding of the genetics and the decision to pardon Kathleen as a beautiful moment that could offer hope to other women in similar situations. The Australian Academy of Science says that this case shows the need for reform that makes the legal system more science sensitive, which Kathleen and Kathleen's lawyer have since echoed. So it's really interesting because now, 20 years later, after her conviction and now being released from prison and pardoned, Kathleen is no longer viewed, she is no longer viewed as a baby killer or a monster. It is said, I've seen some headlines and some of the research that I've done, that misogyny is what helped jail Kathleen, and it's science that freed her. This historic decision would follow one of the worst miscarriages of justice in Australian history, according to Kathleen's lawyer, and it has held up a microscope to what experts call demonstrably unreliable and misogynistic evidence that helped convict her in 2003. It was a case just riddled in suffering that created a media frenzy and saw Kathleen's husband testify against her at trial. And ultimately, it would be the advocacy of friends and new findings from scientists around the world that would help free Kathleen. What I want to say is that it sounds like Kathleen really suffered from postpartum depression. I know some of the symptoms are fear, anxiety, exhaustion, sadness, anger, and even at times considering harming yourself and your child. I think this case is something that must highlight the importance of screening for postpartum depression, but also normalizing it and not alienating mothers when they're feeling depressed and low and dark after they've given birth, or even before. I know it can happen during pregnancy as well. Women should not be vilified for struggling with their mental health because it's normal, and I think it happens more often than not. I think we're getting better about talking about it, but I think there is still a lot of work to be done. And honestly, it's just sickening that Kathleen was vilified and this picture of her was painted to be a monster that murdered her 4 children, when in fact science has proved 20 years later that these babies literally had genetic mutations that they linked to Kathleen's DNA that can explain why they would suddenly pass away. So that is going to complete the case of Kathleen Folbig. Please let me know what you think about this case. I am so impressed by the fierce women that challenged the misogyny in this criminal case and were able to help get her free. For my Australia followers, please let me know if you remember this case from 20 years ago or what your perspective is on it now with such recent news of her being pardoned. Thank you so much for joining me today, and until next time, bye.